Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. Thank you for listening to the podcast. On today's show, I have historian James Horn. Jim Horn is the author of several books, but his most recent, which we are going to be talking about today, is A Brave and Cunning Prince, The Great Chief Opechancanough, and the War for America. It is available now from Basic Books. You can get it on Amazon and anywhere else that you happen to get books. Hopefully it's someplace other than Amazon, at least sometimes, because this Bezos guy's out of control. I mean, he's got his own space program, for God's sake. So if you can't find a independent bookseller, maybe get it from them or Barnes & Noble, another corporation I know. But it doesn't always have to be Amazon. So if you get a chance, help out someone else. But definitely help out Jim. Jim has written a lot about the early American period. And I'm talking really early, before Jamestown, in fact. He is the author of 1619, the other 1619, and A Land as God Made It. 1619, of course, has been in the news a lot the last year or so. The 1619 Project, which I think a book about that is coming out soon. So a lot coming out this fall related to the early America period. We're going to talk about the early years of Virginia, which was settled in 1607, but as Jim shows in the book, was pretty shaky for the first couple decades, shaky to put it mildly, disastrous, one might say, but they obviously held on, and Virginia has been around for more than 400 years at this point. But had a good conversation with Jim, who lives in Richmond, works in Williamsburg, so he is in the right place for studying colonial America. And one of the things I was most worried about with this podcast was how to pronounce Opechancanough. I think Jim pronounces it Opechancanough online. I heard it pronounced Opechancanough. So there are various pronunciations. Maybe I'm getting it wrong, but Jim, who knows a lot more about this than I do, was very nice about the pronunciation. And have you ever noticed how mean some people can be about pronunciation sometimes? I mean, usually it's a honest mistake if you mispronounce something, but some people can really jump on you. But Jim is not like that. He's a pleasant guy, originally from England, so we got to talk a little bit about his background for 20 minutes or so, what I like to do on the show, not just jump into the book, so that we do talk a lot about the book, so you get a sense of where Jim has been from all that long. But he likes Richmond, and we are glad to have him. Jim lived in Brighton for a while, which is in the southern part of England. It is a coastal community and home to the famous fights between the Mods and the Rockers in the 1960s that Pete Townsend immortalized on the Quadrophenia album and later in the film. And looking back, I should have asked Jim if he was a Mod or a Rocker, and would have been even better if Jim had said, neither. I'm a Malka. I have more to say, but this is another one that goes well over an hour, past an hour and a half, so I don't want to go on too long here. I hope you enjoyed my previous episode about the drive-by truckers. You can listen to that right here for free, and there are more than 200 episodes with a lot of great people, prize winners. I've had a Peabody winner, a Pulitzer winner, a Lincoln Prize winner or 2 or 3. Haven't had any Oscar winners, not yet. Check out those back episodes on Libsyn as well as YouTube and Spotify. It's all over the place. iTunes is another place you can get the show. So help out my numbers and listen to the back episodes. All right. Well, without further delay, here it is, my talk with James Horn. I'm guessing this is not your first podcast?
No, actually, I've done a few.
Was it for this book?
I've done quite a few.
Okay, yeah, I bet. And you're in Richmond today?
I am. I mean, I live in Church Hill, as a matter of fact. And you're in Richmond, are you?
I'm in Lakeside, so
the other side of town, but I'm right by the botanical gardens.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I like Church Hill. I was just downtown the other day on my bike. I usually don't ride up to Church Hill because it's a little rough getting up there.
It is.
But I do like that part of town. I'm guessing, have you been there a little while?
About 5 years, because we were living in Williamsburg before that.
Okay.
And Williamsburg is okay, but it's a small town.
It is quiet at
quite
night.
Conservative. Yeah.
You live in Church.
Richmond we really like.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Church Hill, you're on the East End, so getting to Williamsburg, that makes sense if you're living there. I mean, you get you get a little bit of a head start on people that will be like where I'm from or somewhere else in the city. Because, I don't know, do you take Route 5 or you take 64?
64 as fast as I can go and not get arrested.
Yeah, that sounds like me, because I work at Stratford, and I have to go in 2 days a week.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I take 95 for like the first 20 miles, and then I got to take, these other roads that you can go pretty fast on, but I've gotten pulled over before, so they don't give warnings. Have you ever gotten pulled over?
Yeah, once actually, and the guy was actually hidden very well, and not in the usual places that I've come to respect. So yeah, I did get a ticket.
Okay, yeah, that happens. I pretty much know where they are on my route now, but I was working at Hampton, Sydney for a couple of years, and I got tagged once out in Amelia County. Never seen two cops in that exact location before. I think they were trying to get St. Patrick's Day drivers, and they got me in a moment of weakness, so had to go to court for that, which was a real blast. You're originally from England, so how long have you lived in the States?
About 25 years now.
Okay.
Yeah, we came over in 97 and moved to Williamsburg at that point, because I was working at William and Mary at the Institute of Early American History and Culture at that point as a book editor, just a temporary position.
Okay.
But really interesting job, because, of course, being a book editor at the Institute, I got to know a lot of people. And I knew a lot of people anyway, but that helped as well. Then went up to Monticello, then back down to Williamsburg. I know you've got some of this, but and then left Williamsburg.
So it's job related, your move?
Yeah. I've been working on American history for the best part of 40 years, and if not a little longer actually now. But in England, there is an interest in colonial American history, but it's I wouldn't say it's a very strong interest. So it made sense for us to come over here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to go too deep into your background, but I spent a little bit of time in England. You're from Kent?
Yeah.
Which is where is I'm not great on English geography, but is that near London?
Yeah, it is very near.
Okay.
And so a lot of people, for example, commute to London from Kent. I was born in Kent, but spent a lot of time in Brighton on the south coast.
Yeah.
And you may have had a chance to pop down to Brighton on the train at some point, but it's a lovely Georgian, originally Georgian resort, and with the famous piers, became an away day kind of destination for Londoners, and lived there when I was working at University of Brighton for the best part of 20 years. We had a nice little Victorian house there. It's full of little Victorian houses, which is what we've got in Church Hill.
Right.
Because Richmond is a Victorian city, right? So
yeah.
So we're typical Brits. We like small rooms. We like fireplaces. We like gardens with fences. We're like hobbits. We like to fence ourselves in and drink tea.
Yeah, well, good for you. I think Richmond, at least with the downtown, a lot of the older historic parts, yeah, it certainly has a more old world Victorian, even like colonial vibe, and you feel that down in Petersburg too, to a lesser degree. But no, you're right. I mean, I'll see places advertised in the Fan or Churchill. It's a house from 1900 or something. There'll be like 7 fireplaces.
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah, those were the days. Coal burning. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I remember from my background. I still remember the horse and cart bringing the coal
wow.
in these big black bags that the coalman would bring to your house, and that's how you no central heating. This was I was brought up near London, and that was the way you kept yourself warm during cold and wet winters.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, I'm kind of fascinated with England, and I know Brighton mostly through. I don't know if you're a fan of the Who, but their rock opera Quadrophenia is a lot of it has to do with Brighton, and they made a movie and it was set there. So I know it from mostly the Who, but I don't want to date you too badly. But were you growing up when there's still the ripples of World War II with rationing and things like that? Do you go that far back?
Nearly.
Okay.
Not quite. I was brought up in the 50s. I was a young boy in the 50s, and I'm old enough to remember well the mods and rockers fighting it out along the Brighton seafront. The police used to turn up at Brighton Station, intercept the what we call in England the boot boys, and take away their bootlaces, so that when they were trying to kick the mods or get hold of the mods, their boots would come off and they couldn't run away.
That's one way to do it.
That's one way of doing it. They're really great stories, about because that's very much the 60s, as you know.
Yeah.
And just great stories about that in Brighton. But yeah, I was brought up near a place called Woolwich, which is quite a historical place in its own right, because it's a dockland community. Always had been for centuries, docks and shipping, but it got bombed heavily during the war. So I remember growing up when there were big bomb sites. You could still see them all around, but no rationing, fortunately. Okay. Shortages, but no rationing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, because I love that classic rock period, and the more I read about a lot of those big guys who made music in the 60s, was, even if it wasn't necessarily shortages per se, just what it did to families, the war. I mean, a lot of them growing up either with one parent or father who died or a father who left, like as when they were growing up, and just the damage it did to the family structure in a lot of communities, even if they weren't necessarily bombed out, although a lot were. It really seemed to have a major effect on these guys' mentality in the 60s. Did you have relatives that had been in the war? I mean, obviously, your parents were in England when it was getting bombed. Did that play a role in your upbringing? Like, people talking about it or still kind of dealing with it?
Yeah, I'd say so, actually. Yeah. It was because of the Blitz and because of the bombing of the cities. It wasn't just London that got hit hard, and particularly the East End, where I was from, but places like Coventry, Liverpool. They all suffered huge damage from German bombers. So it kind of defined Britain coming out of that, and actually defined relationships with the US to some degree, because there were a lot of US servicemen in Britain, as you know, during that period. One of my aunts married a GI and went off to live in somewhere in Pennsylvania. Lost contact, unfortunately, but it was very positive attitudes towards US servicemen too. So it was a defining moment, I think. And then with the 60s, what's odd about the 60s, you could see it's a transition point. There's the coming through the deprivations of the 50s and early 60s into a much more affluent period during the later 60s, and people beginning to prosper again as Europe rebuilds. So yeah, it was an interesting period for me, at least, to grow up in.
Yeah. Well, I had a guy on the podcast who wrote a book about the Kinks and kind of put them in the historical context of 60s Britain. And like you say, I mean, despite the damage of the war and everything, yeah, England was doing pretty well in a lot of ways. And the whole reason the rock music connected is because teenagers had money and they had jobs and whatever. They're sort of living a bit like Americans, maybe not to that extent. But it was certainly recovering and thriving in a lot of ways.
And I love the Kinks, and I thought the Kinks were great. Really great band. But there are a whole number, as you know. I mean, the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger was from Kent. He was brought up just down the road from where I grew up. So by the, I don't know, 63, 64 onwards, there's this real vibrancy culturally. You see it in TV, you see it in movies, you see it with the rock scene, the music, and the conquest of America kind of thing by the Beatles and other bands. So that was terrific. I really enjoyed that period, and we were getting the American influence, which had a big influence on my life personally, since we learned about people with fridges, big cars, skyscrapers.
Yeah,
we used to call the big cars all boot and bonnet, because they were so long.
Yeah,
but there was almost opulence from the Brits' perspective towards the US, as the US was prospering after the Second World War.
No, absolutely, and given the way things are now, it's tempting to think, maybe America peaked around 1955, 1958.
I think you're right.
In some respects, I don't, want to paint it too broad a brush, but obviously you must have had a deep interest in American history. How did that all start?
I think some of these things go back a long way, don't they? The way we feel towards places or topics, histories. And I do think that it was being brought up in that period, as I mentioned, with my aunt going off to America, that the sense that this was a country that was a nation that was really growing in influence, in power, in wealth. So I was attracted by all that. But I think the clincher came because I was lucky enough to go to a university that had an exchange system with American universities. So I found myself in 1972 at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, at a time when Richard Nixon, it was during an election period, and Richard Nixon was running, and that was my first experience of seeing an American election firsthand, and that was quite something, because there were a lot of protests against the war. Vietnam War at that time in Madison, as elsewhere. Not quite as bad as Chicago, but on campus it got a bit rough, and I stayed out of it. But on the other hand, it was all around you. So I when I went to university, I was studying history and got really wanted to take that further as a graduate.
How long were you in Wisconsin?
Oh, just a semester.
Okay.
It was the semester of the fall of '72, but I went round the US on a Greyhound bus That's the kind of thing you want to do at 19, but perhaps not.
No, I don't. I don't. Yeah, Greyhound is definitely for the young. I think somebody once called it "prison on wheels." Like,
yeah, I'd say a bit like young and foolish, because I was with a number of my mates, and we didn't understand that they would wake you up every 3 hours every time they made a stop at a Greyhound station. You had to get off the bus. At least in those days, I'm talking 50 years ago now, but all the same, you didn't get a lot of sleep basically on the Greyhound. So
where did you go?
Went from Chicago across to San Francisco.
Wow.
Stopping off at places like in the Badlands and
wow.
Cheyenne and places like that. Reno, I remember, because you could get food, all you can eat kind of meals. When you tasted it, you weren't quite certain whether you wanted to eat a lot of it, but I guess that's how they made their money. Salt Lake City, and then back down and across into Texas, and then back up to Chicago. Yeah, so I covered a fair amount of the country.
So did you manage to get to Virginia in that first trip to the U.S.?
I did not, actually. No, that came a few years later. Yeah, in Maryland.
Okay. Yeah. But the West is, those places you rattled off, I mean, those are places I haven't been. I mean, I've been to Chicago, but like the Badlands, like you said, Reno, those kind of Southwest Rocky Mountain places, I haven't been there. But it's certainly, we have a lot of space here for sure. And I think there's sort of a mysticism where you're drawn to it by that, or you just figure, oh, we'll just go here. This sounds good.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you're on a Greyhound bus. You follow the routes.
Okay.
And we had about 3 weeks. I think the ticket, $99 for 3 weeks. Yeah, you could call it. It's an amazing experience, but it was a bit torturous after a while. But what I learned was how big the U.S. I mean, I know this sounds trite, but as a European, it's very hard to experience space like on the scale that you have, say, crossing the Great Plains. The fact there's very little there for 3 days on a bus is something that sticks in your memory, actually.
No, I still can't really wrap my mind around how big this country is, because even Virginia feels like a pretty big state to me, and geographically it's really not. I mean, compared to the Montanas, the Californias, Texas, I mean, it's actually one of the smaller states in size. But I mean, as you know, I mean, England compared to any of those western states is a tiny place, and in England you can get around on the train pretty easily. Here, if you're not in the Northeast, that can be a pretty torturous process if you go cross country, let alone on a bus. I mean, you can't sleep that great on a bus, but like you said, it's something you do when you're younger, and you don't always get the chance to go back when you want to. So, yes.
Yeah, definitely. And I have, we have when I came with my family, but more like probably your experience. I haven't been with my family to, say, Reno. I think no disrespect if anyone's listening, folks. Reno, no disrespect, but it's perhaps an experience that people appreciate more if they're from that region.
So how do you get into when you're studying American history kind of all the way through when you're in Brighton studying? Was that where you did your graduate schooling?
Yeah, I did. I did my graduate work at the University of Sussex, and I did do a little bit of American history when I was an undergraduate. Then started working on what turned out to be my PhD at the University of Sussex. Got a fellowship at Johns Hopkins and started doing research in Maryland and subsequently Virginia. So, Yeah, it really from a point that my starting point was wanting to do local history, because that's what I'd been trained in England, English local history, social history, 16th, 17th, 18th century. So I wanted to apply techniques that had been developed by English historians to early American history, and particularly Virginia and Maryland at that time.
And who are some of the historians that have really made an impact on you, either English or American?
Well, in England, there are a whole number of social historians that, again, because it was a very fertile period in the academic world, and particularly in local history, because of the advent of computers and mechanized ways of sorting large data sets. In England, people like Peter Laslett and Joan Thirsk, the agricultural historian, and Alan Everett, historian of Kent, but a wonderful, wonderful local historian, W.G. Hoskins. But, I could keep going. In the US, actually, it was the historians of early New England, of the New England town, like Kenneth Lockridge and Philip Greven, Timothy Breen. I got really interested in the way they went about studying these very early communities in New England, particularly Massachusetts, but didn't want to work on New England. I felt that was covered. I wanted to work on Virginia and Maryland.
And you're in graduate school when, we're talking mid-70s?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mid-70s. I was at Johns Hopkins in 76, 77, working with a guy called Jack Green.
Oh, yeah.
But really working down at what was called, and I love the name because it is what it is, the Hall of Records in Annapolis, Maryland. And Maryland has just fabulous records from the 17th century, 18th century onwards. And I was there at a time when a whole number of early American historians were working on early Maryland. So it was a good time to arrive.
Yeah. Well, and it seems like a lot of early American historians, they tend to combine everything into the Chesapeake. So you have Maryland, Virginia. So in my first semester of grad school, those were kinds of things we were getting. We're getting like Alan Kulikoff, tobacco and slaves, I think it was, and Jack Green. And then later I read Phil Morgan for my comps and stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of blending between Maryland and Virginia. But did you kind of get away from Maryland eventually and just focus on Virginia, or were you still kind of using some Maryland sources later?
I did actually escape from Maryland eventually. I had a great experience there, so that's probably the wrong way of putting it. But
yeah.
I think Virginia, and what I learned very quickly is that, and I'm sure Marylanders would agree with this, is that Virginia, although it's Chesapeake, is quite different. I mean, obviously there are parallels with tobacco cultivation, the tobacco industry, parallels with the introduction of very early introduction of slavery, parallels with Indian peoples, but for all that, Virginia is still quite a different place, and I wanted to focus on Virginia, where keeping in mind that my work was transatlantic, because I was really interested in the experience of migrants coming from England in this period and making this tremendous commitment and risking their lives to cross the Atlantic. You just got to think about ships being the airliners of the aeroplanes of the 17th century, but if you think being on a 747 is bad enough, just imagine what it's like being on a wooden sailing ship for 6 to 8 to even 12 weeks. So you had to be either pretty desperate or really want to risk it. to make that trip.
Yeah. No, reading this book, as I told him, and I hadn't read about colonial Virginia in a while, and it gets pretty grim. I mean, it's almost like the Donner Party, it's towards the
right.
Travel and cannibalism and all that stuff. Yeah. No, so it's pretty rough stuff. Maybe just I'm enjoying talking about your background, but I know we want to get to the book. You have written a number of books that deal heavily with this time period and this geography, this landscape. So maybe just sort of talk about why you wanted to write this book and what you set out to do in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in a number of my books, the central character of this most recent book, Opechancanough. That's the way I pronounce it, by the way.
I was wondering how we did that.
Right. I mean, it's a free country. So.
Well, and does anyone really know? I mean, I don't know. Maybe there are tribes today that would know better than we would. I mean, I went online and I heard a pronunciation. Yeah. I was like, I guess that sounds good, but I've pronounced his name before and I was just kind of winging it. So I guess.
Well, how did you pronounce it?
I think it was similar. I think it was like Opechancanough is how I pronounced it.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So it's being a free country, which is one of the reasons I moved here, actually. At least for now, Colin.
All right.
So you better edit that bit out. But yeah, there are peoples, Algonquian peoples, which is the language of the peoples of the Chesapeake coastal area. Algonquian, that's the language group. Still in northern parts of the country today, but their kind of language, their form of Algonquian was probably a little bit different from that of this region, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina.
Okay.
So I tend to work phonetically as best I can, and the way in which, of course, all of the records from this written records of this period are from. Sorry, I'm getting a message up on the screen here.
Okay.
Are from the English. I mean,
right.
Necessarily from the English. Indian peoples of this region didn't have a written language, so therefore using a kind of phonetic approach, it seems to me Opechancanough is one version. But the reason that I wanted to write about him, he's featured in a number of my other books, but I think this is an incredible story that most people know very little about. And I think it's also an important story from the point of view of rather changing the angle of vision as to what was going on. If we think about what is colonial America, what makes America colonial? Well, it's almost self-defining in the sense that colonization in this period, 16th and early 17th centuries, really means European invasions, and particularly the Spanish, the Portuguese, and subsequently the English. So the way I very rarely use the word colonial because I think it's freighted. It's a word that's freighted with a certain kind of meaning, i.e. some of the studies that have been done on the use of the word colonial by the colonizing powers. But what it boils down to is really a contest between European nations, states, and the Indian peoples who have been living in various regions for either hundreds or even thousands of years, and that contest for the territory that they occupy. And that can be applied from all the way from the Arctic Circle all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. If you look at what's taking place, the 16th, 17th, 18th into the 19th centuries, these cycles of conflict as Europeans move into and appropriate take possession of Native American land. So this story, this book is a way of looking at that, taking a case study, but looking at that development in our history, more from the point of view of the Native American populations that were largely the victims of colonization during this period.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting story, and I had never read that deeply into Opechancanough, but he's an interesting figure. Obviously, what happens with the English later, but just given how long he lived, I mean, he lived to be into his 90s, and to add to the confusion of names, he's called different things at different points in his life. So maybe talk about his early life, where he came from, and sort of how he arrives on the stage in colonial Virginia.
Yeah, he does lead a long life, and it's a very dramatic period in the history of early America and the history of Atlantic America, because we want to keep in mind all the time that there are two sides to the Atlantic, and so what's going on in Europe can be just as important as what's going on the ground in, say, Virginia or anywhere else. And that's something I'll come back to later, because I think the Atlantic experience of Opechancanough sets him apart from any of his contemporaries. So we're talking about a very early period. We're talking about a century that spans the mid-16th to the mid-17th century. So we're not talking about Indian wars from later periods, the 18th or 19th or early 20th centuries. We're talking about a very, very early period in the development of British America and to some extent an early period in Spanish America. Opechancanough is taken from Virginia in 1561. He's probably about 14 or 15 by that time, so he's still a teenager, and he's abducted. And we're pretty certain that he was taken against his will. The Spanish have records saying that he willingly agreed to go aboard the Spanish ship, but it's most unlikely that he signed up to cross the Atlantic with the Spanish to go to Europe. So he's abducted and is taken to Spain, and this is where the story gets really interesting, because he's taken to the court of Philip II. So here's this young man, only in his mid-teens, who is given an audience with the most powerful monarch in Europe, and one of the most powerful people in the world. And he manages to persuade Philip. He manages to persuade great princes of the Catholic Church, courtiers, other influential men of this period. This is all taking place in Madrid, the imperial capital. He manages somehow to persuade them that he is a sincere convert, will convert to Catholicism, but not only that, but lead missionaries back to America to convert his people in the Chesapeake Bay area. The degree of intelligence, skill, some people would say guile, needed to do that at this time, and the ability to persuade people of great sophistication. I mean, we're not talking about people who were somewhat easy to fool, but the ability to do that is simply outstanding. But he manages to do that, and eventually he manages thereby to get back to Virginia and his land and his people. So He spent 10 years in Spain, in Mexico City, in Havana, Cuba. 10 years going back and forth across the Atlantic. 10 years of seeing the devastation the Spanish had wrought in Mexico. These experiences were, particularly at the stage he was of his life, these experiences were formative for him and had a great bearing on subsequent events, not in Spanish America, but English America later on. So that's why I think this is a remarkable story.
No, it absolutely is. And I know he was a young guy when he was doing that traveling early on in his life, but as you say, he's going to these various countries, and given the disease rate, what travel was like, that he was able to survive those journeys and living in those different countries in itself is kind of amazing. But he was certainly a great survivor, and as you say, he's a very shrewd guy. Maybe talk a little bit about, because early on when he's whatever you want to call it, a captive of the Spanish or living among Spanish people, he's called Don Louis, correct?
Correct, yeah.
And there's been some dispute among historians if this is the same person. You want to talk about that? Same person as Opechancanough.
Yeah, he does have a number of names. The only record of his own name by the Spanish, recorded in Spanish documents, is Opechancanough. That's a little bit more like Opechancanough than Don Louis. But there's only one recording that was made in the House of Trade when he first arrived in Spain in 1561. They recorded his name as Opechancanough, interestingly. But after that, he's renamed Don Louis de Velasco. Don Louis de Velasco, after the Viceroy of New Spain, which covered it covered Mexico and a good deal of what later became Florida, Spanish Florida, as well as the islands. So he's named for that Viceroy, who was considered to be a supporter of Indian welfare in Mexico City and elsewhere in the province. What leads me to believe, though, that Don Louis Opechancanough was the same person as Opechancanough, as the English named him. I think and I lay this out in the book because I think it's quite an interesting detective story. There are too many coincidences. We would have to accept a range of coincidences that I believe would be just highly improbable. Don Louis, historians agree, came from the Chesapeake region, Virginia specifically, and was taken by the Spanish in 1561. That's how this book opens up. Opechancanough, it's generally believed, was born in the 1540s, mid-1540s, late 1540s, but around that mid-century mark in Virginia. So both the same age, they're both from the same area. But I think so that could be a coincidence, but I think the clincher is that various English records from the 17th century refer to Opechancanogh's Spanish connections. And I think that when you look at all that evidence, combined with how he tactically and strategically treats the English in the wars of the early 17th century in Virginia, I think that's compelling that they were one and the same. I think only Opechancanough could have come up with the approach, with the tactics to get rid of the English from Virginia, based on his knowledge of the Spanish and what European invasions were like, and the devastation that they would bring to his land and his people.
Well, and so he leaves Virginia, you said around 1561, is that right?
That's right.
And he returns 1570, 71?
Yep.
Okay.
70, yeah.
Okay, so talk about what happens with the Jesuits in 1571. It seems that's a real turning point in his life.
It is, and there's a lot of material about this written by Jesuits, which it is aimed at memorializing the Jesuit fathers who were murdered by Don Louis and his Confederates, his war party in 1571. So just to step back, the Jesuits arrived to set up a Jesuit mission in 1570. The whole idea here is that Don Louis will lead the effort to convert his people. His people will become Catholic. This was a proven way of colonization, that the church would sometimes come before, would precede the military involvement. So there's no military involvement here. It's just a group of Jesuits, about a dozen Jesuits, who set up a small wooden house somewhere, I believe, near the Chickahominy River, for those people who live in this region and know the area. And also, interestingly, an area that's near what we now call the York River, called at the time the Pamunkey River, after the Indian tribe who lived there. And Opechancanough was a Pamunkey. So I think he leads the Jesuits to a place. He guides the ship that takes the Jesuits to this region. And I think he leads them to a place where he's surrounded by his people, and they can cut off the Jesuits and kill them, which they did in the winter of 1571. And that pretty much ends the Spanish effort to invade and colonize Virginia. There are no subsequent efforts to do that. So that is a crucial intervention by Don Louis Opechancanough.
I know the English, they're trying to make inroads in Virginia in the late 1500s, but they don't establish Jamestown till more than 30 years after this event. Maybe talk a little bit about sort of the Native American culture, his relationship with people like Powhatan, Pocahontas. I mean, he's a great warrior, but he's also there. There are various tribes that to some degree are at each other's throats. So it's not just about fending off the English; it's also defending themselves against other tribes. But maybe just talk about kind of who he's running with in this time period, and these big names that we know like Pocahontas and Powhatan, how he's related to those.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that understanding the Indian cultures at the time is absolutely fundamental to any understanding of what's going to happen subsequently when the English arrive, as you say, in 1607. So if we step back a little, this is a region that's occupied by a group of peoples that go under the general name of Powhatans. So by the time that the English arrived, there are probably about 15,000 people living in the Tidewater region, the coastal region of Virginia, scattered in a couple of hundred towns and villages, mainly gathered along the rivers. So there are people of the rivers. They still are, actually. The Indian peoples that still live in Virginia are clustered along major rivers or associated with major rivers. And it is a regime, and I think this is something to do with Opechancanoug's, Don Louis' experience. It's a regime that has been built up over the previous 30, 35 years. It's a Paramount Chiefdom is the historian's term. But we could just really see it as a Great Chiefdom. This is one of the most powerful chiefdoms on the mid-Atlantic coast. And that's owing, I think, to both Opechancanough and his brother, who is who is the paramount chief, his name is Powhatan, named for his people. And they build up these 32 chiefdoms into this great chiefdom. And it is a war regime. It's built for war. It had been expanding ever since the 1570s. Neither Powhatan or Opechancanough knew whether the Spanish would return. In fact, they didn't, but they couldn't have known that. In fact, from Opechancanogh's experience, it was more than likely that they would return. So they needed a powerful alliance amongst chiefdoms, regional chiefdoms, to be able to fend off an invasion from the Spanish. So there is this gap in the historical record between the 1570s and the early 17th century, where we certainly know that the Powhatan chiefdom develops rapidly during that period. And it is, I think, likely that Opechancanough, who was a war chief responsible for external relations, took a leading role in that expansion of this great powerful chiefdom.
Okay. And it seems like things change, obviously, with Jamestown in 1607, but I mean, reading your book, Jamestown's really hanging on by a thread at a lot of this early period, first 20 years, even beyond. You sort of ended in, I think, around the 1640s. It's
Right.
Pretty rough going, but it seems like John Smith, again, is another turning point, not only just because who he was, but also the sources that we have, record keeping of what's going on with his life and Indian relations and everything. Maybe just talk a little bit about who John Smith is and how things change once he arrives in Virginia.
Yeah, it's Jamestown is the major settlement in early Virginia, and you can almost describe the colony as Jamestown in the first few years. From the point of view of its power and influence, I'm pretty certain Powhatan and Opechancanough would have considered it pitiful. The number of men that arrived, there's only 100 men, 104 to be precise, men and boys who arrive in 1607. No women initially. It is meant to be a garrison to establish a toehold in the region, in the Chesapeake region, and also to undertake exploration. There's still, this might seem odd to us, but this colony, sponsored by a commercial group in London, are still looking for gold and silver mines in the mountains. So, the old adage, there's gold in them, there are mountains, actually does apply very much to the 16th and 17th centuries. Both Spanish, including the Spanish, French, and English, all look for gold, silver, copper in the mountains of the coastal regions, Appalachians. So it is a very weak colony, nothing like the powerful garrisons that the Spanish set up in 50 years earlier, half a century or a century earlier. And to that extent, you got to wonder, where does this leave Powhatan and Opechancanough? Are there any advantages to having Europeans encamped in what was called by them Paspahegh country, after the name of the tribe? They called Jamestown Paspahegh. Could there be an advantage? And I think it's pretty clear that what you get in a very early period is a sense of scoping each other out and seeking advantage. Both sides are trying to gain something from the other. And someone like John Smith, who was an adventurer, these early settlers, they're not really settlers, they're adventurers, they're people on the make. They're looking for, they want to get rich quick, go back to England. They're not looking to become established families or farmers. It's nothing to do with farming. This is all about finding the gold and then getting out, getting back. So John Smith is typical of that kind of person, in Englishman, adventurer in this period, and he is the one who, as an acute observer of Indian ways of life, really picks up on the negotiations going back and forth between the English leaders at Jamestown and the two great chiefs at their capital called Warracomico in Virginia. So that's the way things are working out in this period.
It may seem weird at first that this colony is essentially a commercial venture, not necessarily for king and country. But you kind of look at now with space exploration, you see Bezos going up in space. It's kind of similar in the sense of you have billionaires with corporate money who are doing it, and maybe, I don't know, they'll be the first ones to get to Mars. I don't know. But I guess if you can make some kind of connection, you could do that,
Well, it's a great analogy because, and I can't help mentioning William Shatner going up into into space, looking for the final frontier. In person. Very impressive. But the parallels there. Private corporations who might set up mining operations on the moon or elsewhere, as you say. This is exactly what's going on with the great merchants of London, a very important commercial hub by the early 17th century. I'm trying to dispel here the idea that English people necessarily went to early America to farm the land. They went to get land, but not necessarily to farm it. They wanted to occupy, explore, and find the wealth.
Well, and I mean, as you show in this book again and again, I mean, a lot of these Indian raids, the English, are taking the corn because they can't grow their own, or the farming, as you say, is totally incompetent, and they can't even feed themselves, and they're not planning, setting up long term, it doesn't seem.
Yeah, that's right. And we're talking here about the first arrivals, and maybe for the next 5-6 years. Ultimately, with tobacco becomes a product that's valuable in Europe, can be grown I won't say easily, because that's not the case. It's a backbreaking job to grow tobacco, and you've got to have some skills to prepare it for shipment. Otherwise, it rots in the hold of the ships going back. But it becomes a great lucrative cash crop. But initially, at least, it's all about getting into the interior. So Jamestown is not on the coast. It's 50 miles or so in from the Atlantic. And that is a launching point for various expeditions into the mountains. And again, the English are adopting practices that had been pioneered by the Spanish, Portuguese, and French 50 years earlier. So that's how they're coming at it.
Yeah. Well, you can't eat tobacco, so if you're growing a lot of tobacco and you're starving, you got to come up with another plan. But you say in 1610, Jamestown is abandoned temporarily, correct?
It is. It just briefly, just for a day or so. But one of the things I wanted to underline in this book, because I think there's some misunderstanding about this, is that the first English Indian Wars took place in Virginia in this very early period. So 1609, conflict breaks out between the Powhatan and the English. Jamestown is besieged, 300 people trapped within the palisade walls of James Fort. and maybe about 60 of those survive into the spring of 1610. So out of 360 survive. There's another 50 guys downriver, but all the same, the colony is on the brink of disaster, and Jamestown, the leaders decide to abandon the colony, head for Newfoundland, and then from there back to England. Now, that's one of the closest points that the Powhatan come to expelling the English from their territories. They never get as close as that again, but of course that's in hindsight that we could see that. But nevertheless, Jamestown is really on the brink of collapse by that period. And
this is the period of the starvation, the cannibalism, the really horrible stuff. Is what, winter 1609, 1610? Is that when it's really at the nadir for the settlers?
It really is. Yeah. It's John Smith names it the starving time. And he wasn't there at that time. He was back in England by then. But it is the starving time, and at Jamestown, the original site, archaeological site where I work, we've actually discovered physical evidence of cannibalism from the remains of a young girl who was about 14 or 15, probably arrived in the summer of 1609 and probably had succumbed by the winter of 1609, 1610.
Without getting too morbid, how can you tell if someone has been cannibalized, or how do you tell that archaeologically? Are there from bone records, or how do you do that?
Yeah, we have the best part of a significant part of her skull. We work with the Smithsonian Museum Institution to look at forensic evidence, and we've worked for many years with a man called Dr. Doug Owsley, who identified marks on the skull as being cut marks. Just to get into this bit, it's a bit grisly.
Okay.
But
sure.
But the cut marks are, without any question, they're not marks subsequently made by someone digging the area, or a plow or a spade or whatever. They are deliberate marks made to take the meat off the face and off the skull. She was, we do believe she was dead when this was happening. She wasn't being cannibalized while she was still living, and there is a historical record. John Smith records it, for example, that this was a time of such deprivation that they resorted to eating the dead.
Yeah. No, I guess, again, it's been a while since I've read about this time period. I guess I'd kind of forgotten how bad it really was, because we have a tendency to see things as inevitable. And Jamestown, 1607, Virginians know their history, they know that date, and so everything moving forward is just kind of the inevitable triumph of history, and 400 years later we're still here. But since they're hanging on by such a thin thread at this point, maybe talk a little bit about, in terms of Opechancanough and his strategy. It seems like he maybe just could have wiped out the English entirely, or really just kind of gone in for the kill, but that doesn't happen. Maybe you can just talk about why that didn't happen. Was it because he didn't want to, or was it maybe just some sort of tactical shortcoming on his part? Kind of what happens there?
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I take the view that neither Powhatan nor Opechancanough went in for the kill because they thought the colony was going to collapse anyway.
Okay.
And that this wasn't just a view shared by them, it was a view shared in Europe, that for example, by Spain, by Philip III. Philip III, the successor of the man that Opechancanough met, was being counselled by his officers of state that the colony could not be saved. So Europeans, Powhatans, they all believed the colony was in its death throes by 1610. What happens really is, and this is something that Opechancanough was surprised by, and I think tactically it's unclear what he could have done about it, but we'll see later how he begins to respond to a new reality, is that the English kept on coming. They sent more ships, more soldiers, more adventurers, settlers. They just kept coming. So despite the terrible setbacks, despite the fact this is a commercial undertaking that had made, in today's terms, millions of dollars in losses, they still kept going. They still believed that there was a fortune to be made in North America, just as the Spanish had made fortunes in gold and silver and other precious goods from South America. That was the mindset that kept driving this enterprise of Virginia onwards. And that was what Opechancanough came to realize would be the major problem for him and his people in terms of developing a strategy to get rid of the English.
Yeah, because I mean these wars continue for a long time, and it seems like, well, the first one, you said 1609, lasts about 5 years, and then in 1622 there's another major war that breaks out. Could you just kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and the intervening period there, it is a kind of Cold War or false truce, because the English, and it's just to give you a sense of how marginal this colony is, even after that first war. So the first war ends in 1614. A couple of years later, there's still only 300 English settlers in the entire colony. Now, you think how large this colony is compared to English standards. This isn't the equivalent even of a small hamlet in England. I mean, it's tiny, spread along the James River Valley, all the way from the mouth of the James River up to more or less where Richmond is today. That's a pretty large area, and to just have 300 people living there is, as I say, that's pretty marginal. So
Yeah.
This intervening period is, I think, very, very important in understanding how Opechancanough develops his strategy, his own strategy. I take the view he deposes Powhatan. Powhatan dies in 1618. Don't want to get too far into various dates and so on, but Opechancanough is the defective Paramount Chief years before that. So there's a change in the governance of this great empire, and Opechancanough is a much more aggressive ruler of his peoples than Powhatan was. And I think he's also, because of his awareness of the dangers that Europeans represent, I think he's much more subtle than his predecessor also. And what happens is really one whereby Opechancanough seduces the English into false sense of security. And interestingly, towards the period the time when he launches the first of his great attacks on the colony and the colonists, he suggests that he might convert, this time to Anglicanism, the Church of England. And this again, I think, is a crucial part of the strategy. He's thinking, give the settlers what they want. What they want is to convert the Indian peoples to the Church of England, to make them English, making the Indians English would give the colony a population of thousands and thousands of converted Anglo-Indian people. So that was the approach that was being taken by both the English, that was their ambition, and by Opechancanough in seemingly going along with that towards 1622.
And to provide some context of how important religion is for the settlement, because you have, to oversimplify things, in North America, you have the French to the north, in Canada and northern North America, and then the English are in the center, sort of, along the coast. And you got the Spanish to the south. Two Catholic countries with sort of a Anglican country in the middle, the sandwich here of colonization. So, and as you say, that religion is a big part of this and what they're trying to do, outside of the profit motive, which is important initially, but as time goes on, they want this to be an Anglican colony.
Absolutely, and it's to be a Protestant bulwark against Spanish America. Spain was the superpower of the day. Spain was the most powerful nation, and a good deal of that had arisen because of the wealth from the West Indies, from Middle America and South America, which went into the coffers of successive Spanish monarchies. So the English were aware that they were losing ground in terms of wealth, power, military capacity. These were the great states, if you like, were Spain, France. They had to do something to reverse that, and they had to have their own American empire and American riches.
And in 1624, the crown finally takes over Virginia, correct?
It does, and it's a direct result of the Great Attack that was launched in 1622, and the approach that Opechancanough takes is a highly dramatic but also effective strategy, whereby he had determined already that he could not defeat the English if they were up against European weaponry, firearms particularly, cannon particularly, but also steel-edged weapons. The Indians had tried to, under Powhatan and Opechancanough, gather as many European weapons as they possibly could, either by stealing or taking by force European weapons, English weapons. In fact, that was why they kept the colony going initially, was to acquire not just European trade goods, but European weaponry. They understood, in other words, the power of European weapons and the way that using them, not only against the English but other Indian peoples, would allow them to expand over a greater region to the west and south. So what he does is spends a number of years making friends with the English. His people make friends with the English. He talks about conversion to Anglicanism, all to get within the Palisades, to get within the fortified settlements, to lull the English, as I said earlier, into a false sense of security, and then launch a devastating attack. Now, this March 22nd, 1622, is one of the most devastating attacks ever organized by indigenous peoples against a colonizing power, such as Spanish or French or English. There's something like 1,000 people in the colony by 1622, maybe 1,200 or so. At least a quarter, probably nearer a third, are killed, not only wounded, but killed within a single day, and probably within maybe 6 to 8 hours during the morning and early afternoon. It's a coordinated attack all along the James River Valley. So Opechancanough shows himself to be a master strategist and also a master at organizing his warriors, coordinating the different warrior groups to attack the English settlements along a stretch that's probably about 80 miles long from the falls, beyond the falls of the James River, down towards the mouth of the James River. I mean, it's simply a brilliant strategy and a brilliantly executed attack. And I don't think people have ever really understood that or understood the just how successful that strategy was.
I don't want to jump ahead too far, but in terms of, I mean, eventually Opechancanough was killed after this another big war in the 1640s. Kind of, what is the key to success with the English? Is it just sheer numbers that they can kind of replenish the colony again and again? Is it that they're just barely able to hang on militarily in terms of their forts, their cannons, their weaponry? Is it a technological advantage? Is it just a population advantage? Like, why are the tribes really able to once and for all defeat the English in this time period?
It is. Certainly it's technological, and I believe Opechancanough understood that among his warriors there was a serious technological deficit. They didn't have the kind of power that the English had. And actually, it's not just the weaponry, but also the ships to be able to move troops along the rivers, almost amphibious campaigns, a number of them, both in the 1620s and in the 1640s. Very difficult to defend when those groups of maybe 50 to 100 soldiers disembark and just carry out total warfare. And it really was scorched earth. This is the burning down of villages, the killing of men, women, and children. So this is a reminder that when we're talking about atrocities, the English viewed 1622 as a massacre, but on the English side, there's extreme violence is being applied to Indian populations, and would be the case, would be applied for years to come. So technology and, yes, also demography, population. And the Powhatan tried to find out just how many people, what they were up against by sending envoys, including Pocahontas, to England. But the news that came back wasn't very encouraging. There were just so many people that they were outnumbered. The only way that I think Opechancanough believed he could defeat the English would be an overwhelming military victory, which he believed he achieved actually with 1622, and then once again to come back to starvation, that the English would starve. And there was a starving time in the winter of 1622-23 that was even worse in terms of English casualties than the one before that, earlier one.
Yeah. So do you think we can, since the sources do seem to be all on the English side, is it hard to get inside Opechancanoug's mind, or do you think you can pretty well posit what he's thinking at various points, just given his actions? Do you think maybe he figures, well, the more we attack, the more we might lose, and we might not be able to hold on long term? If we're not dealing with the English, maybe we have to deal with someone else. So it's maybe, on the one hand, he could maybe wipe out the English even worse, but it's also a matter of self-preservation with him. As I think as any military commander, the more you attack, the more you might lose, and in essence, it's self-defeating. I guess kind of you know what I'm saying? Like, it's a twisted way. Like, in terms of strategy, you always have to weigh those options as a commander, I think. Like, yeah, we can keep attacking, but should we have a bad day and half our guys are wiped out, we're done for.
Yeah, which is why he strenuously avoided frontal attacks. He knew that if his warriors were charging at either a fortified palisade or ranks of musketeers, they would be wiped out, and we have evidence of that from an attack such as that made by another Indian commander, and the results were terrible for the Indians. But I think what he hoped for was that that with sufficient losses, either because the English would tire of the effort to colonize Virginia, or because they would be distracted by other events. And this is what happens in the 1640s, because he learns of the English Civil War. So England is in turmoil in the best part of the 1640s, and he wants to take advantage of that. And again, we're talking here about a colony that's still getting huge amounts of food and goods from England, even in the 1640s. So cut off that shipping, because there's other events taking place that take precedence, and maybe the English will decide it's just not worth the candle and start to move out. I think that by the 1640s was his hope, and clearly, it didn't come to fruition. But you can see the reasoning behind that.
And he's killed in 1646. He's essentially captured, and then a soldier shoots him in the back. Is that what happens?
Yeah, he's taken to Jamestown. So he's captured. It's not quite clear where he's captured, but somewhere in the maybe the interior wilds of further upriver. But he's taken to Jamestown, where he meets the governor of Virginia, Sir William Berkeley, and I think it's very likely this is where the narrative is a bit Spartan, because I think it's very likely that Sir William was very interested in Opechancanough. He's a man who had lived for nearly 100 years by that point, and maybe questioned him about his life and times and so on and so forth, and even considered taking Opechancanough back to England, despite it being a civil war going on, to meet King Charles I in England. But he was unable to do that when the soldier killed him in his prison.
Okay, and not to go too deep into it, but sort of what happens after Opechancanoug's death in terms of Native and English relations in Virginia. In the 1670s, you get Bacon's War, which is really kind of an Indian war in its own right. But what happens after he dies? Is there a vacuum there that needs to be filled, or what goes on?
Yeah, I think it's the beginning of the end of the Great Powhatan Chiefdom. Tribes, and in Virginia, of course, Indian peoples do call themselves tribes. That they begin to move out the area. Some move to the south into the Carolinas. Others move to the west or join up with other peoples. So there is an approach, I suppose you could call it, a strategy of avoidance, just moving out of areas where the English were beginning to settle. The Powhatan Empire breaks up. There are several powerful leaders still, but essentially it's the end of that effort to expel the English. There's no possibility after 1646 of the English leaving Virginia.
Yeah, for sure. And well, I've had you a little while, so I've got a couple more questions for you. But I guess the first one would be, in looking at this story, which is, you talk about atrocities on both sides. Could it have gone any better, for lack of a better phrase? Like, is it just sort of inevitable clash of cultures that's going to end badly, or do you think there are choices either the tribes make or maybe the English make that make this especially horrible? Could this story have gone any better than it did?
Probably not, I have to say. The only way it could have gone better is probably if Jamestown had collapsed in 1610 or maybe in 1623. Those were the two moments when English Virginia came closest to collapse. And then, of course, the Indian peoples would have been spared the next several hundred years of oppression from English settlers. So that was probably the only outcome for the Indian peoples. As for the English, it was a lottery for those that did manage to survive the Atlantic crossing, survived the dreadful mortality rates in early Virginia, rates even worse than contemporary London in this period. If they survived all that and made a fortune off tobacco, that turned out to be the gold that they were seeking, not in the mines in the mountains. So for a few, they did make it. They did make a fortune out of it, and they're the ones who were the beneficiaries of the colonization process.
Yeah. And I guess my last question is, everything's politicized now to the nth degree, and to say the least, there's a lot of baggage in this country in terms of Native American history, how they've been treated through time, and when people read these sources, it's very easy to play the blame game, I think, and especially when you have atrocities on both sides. How maybe should we approach these sources or approach this story? Because, depending on who you're talking about, Opechancanough who you're talking to, Opechancanough is a terrorist, or he's a freedom fighter, or maybe he's a little of both. How do you sort of frame this story? Like, how should we approach this time period in American history?
It is, I think it is a sensitive political issue, but I think for all the right reasons, if I can put it like that. I think for too long, American history has been seen through the lens of the victors. If you consider the colonists, I mean, that's why I choose not to use the word colonial America, because America was inhabited by peoples who'd lived there for millennium, and would be inhabited by oppressed peoples from Africa. So, they were victims of colonization, but they were not. I don't think we can just say colonial America is a story just of the whites and the success of the whites, the manifest destiny, in other words.
Right.
I think so there is a reckoning. I think this country is at that point of reckoning at the moment, or maybe one of the points of reckoning. A reckoning about the role of race in our society and the diverse peoples that make up our society. I take the view that diversity is part of our national DNA. Diversity has always been there. America has been always one of the most diverse societies in the world. And it may seem strange to say that when you think of great European cities or Asia or Africa. But if you think about it, it's in America that peoples from the Old World, New World, and Africa come together to create a new kind of society, initially on very unequal terms. I think we need to do more and do better to recognize that, to recognize the devastation caused by Europeans during this phase. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to tell this story about Opechancanough, because he didn't commit a massacre. The word used by the English in 1622 was barbarous, or phrase, barbarous massacre, the barbarous massacre of 1622. Well, he's fighting for his land. His people are fighting for survival. Would we as Americans see ourselves as perpetrating a massacre against invaders if we were attacked in that way? So, words have certain kinds of meanings and can carry misunderstandings very, very easily. And I think it's important that we come to terms with our history if we're going to come to terms with who we are as a people and who we will be as a people going forward.
Yeah, and this story sort of gets played out again and again in American history up until the late 19th century and through the Civil War up to, Little Bighorn, Wounded Knee, the story of wars between whites and the tribes and the inevitable kind of march of essentially colonists going into the western part of America. I mean, we don't necessarily frame it that way in terms of colonialism, but it's essentially what the U.S. government is doing, is putting settlements and native land. So there's unfortunately there's a foreshadowing here, but I think also too, I mean, I'm as guilty of this as anyone, but not necessarily having a hands-on relationship with native history. I mean, these tribes are still there in a lot of ways. I mean, you can go to places outside of Richmond, in Richmond area, where there's that tribal history. You can see where all these things happened, and people don't do it as much as they should. So, it's unfortunate we sort of learn all this stuff either just through books or through movies or whatever. But if people maybe could just not necessarily get worked up over the emotion in these stories and the tragedy, but just actually try to experience some of this, because just about every place in this country has some kind of native presence. It's not always obvious, but it's there.
Yeah, and in some cases, particularly out west, it's probably much more obvious. But but I would say that if we are to confront the legacies of what took place 400 years ago or 200 years ago, then we have to take into account that the poorest peoples in our society today are Native Americans and African Americans. And take any statistic you care to choose, and the inequality, and the country is already suffering from massive inequalities. But the inequalities amongst, say, comparing white families with black families or with Indian peoples are absolutely staggering. So that is a direct legacy, not just of what's happened since the Civil War. This isn't something that just occurred from the mid-19th century or even as part of the 20th century. This is something that's been embedded for 4 centuries. That doesn't mean that we can't deal with it, but it means that it's been a part of our history for a long time. Recognizing that will help us overcome it, I think.
Yeah. Well, and just things you talk about, Native people, African American communities that just don't have things as basic as good drinking water. I mean, you hear about stories in Flint or on certain reservations. During COVID, I was hearing stories about a tribe that didn't have any drinking water. So it's just very basic and very infuriating to hear those kinds of stories, because this is this is a country where everyone should at the very least have the basics met, and that's not always happening.
Yeah, I think the word I would use, and I'm not trying to be pretentious or judgmental, but it's shameful. It really is shameful that in the richest country in the world, there are people that have inadequate social services, educational opportunities, the kind of discrimination that has gone on right into and beyond the 20th century. And of course, some of these attitudes are still very much there in a country that prides itself on everyone's got opportunities to make a fortune. Well, I mean, we really need to dispense with fantasies like that, because the vast majority of people don't have an opportunity to get very far, and that's becoming a structural element in our society, and race is one of the key determinants. And isn't it time that we took that seriously and dealt with it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in any major city, Richmond is not a huge city, but you can see those disparities. You can see where the work needs to be done, and it's not going away no matter how good the economy is or whatever. We just, have a lot of structural problems that go back a long way and are mixed into our history. So, well, I'm glad we have you in Richmond, Jim. we need good historians here. So I'm glad you were able to talk.
Yeah, thanks, Colin.
All right.
Pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Take care.
All right, that was my talk with James Horn. I hope you enjoyed that. Once again, his book is called A Brave and Cunning Prince, the Great Chief Opechancanough, and the War for America. Once again, if I am pronouncing that wrong, I apologize. But if you know how to pronounce it, congratulations, and hope you will forgive me. This has been American Rambler. I am your host, Colin Woodward, the author of Marching Masters, Slavery, Race, and the Confederate Army During the Civil War, available through University of Virginia Press. I've not sold a book in a little while, so if you could buy a copy or tell someone else to do it, or tell your students to do it by force, if you need to conscript them into the purchase of a book, I don't care. I would appreciate that for grad students or undergrads. Also, get it on Kindle for cheaper. So please check out my book and check out those back episodes. Man, have you been following all the stuff that's coming out about Clapton? Every now and then on Twitter, you'd hear someone call Clapton a racist, and I was like, come on. I mean, he was drunk, I think, when he had that incident on stage. It was a long time ago. So I've been trying to give the dude the benefit of the doubt, and usually when I've seen him in interviews, he seems like a pretty nice guy, but this stuff about the anti-vax statements he'd been making came out, and now I'm hearing stuff from Patty Boyd, who was married to George Harrison before she married Clapton, reading stuff about how he was when they were together, and that was pretty rough. And again, some of it can be chalked up to addiction, but it doesn't seem like it was only about that. It's just kind of the way he is. So I don't know why he won't shut up about the vax stuff. I guess he thinks he was harmed by it. But I saw him in a picture with Governor Abbott of Texas the other day, and I think I have to be done liking Eric Clapton. I mean, I'll still always like the music. I love Cream and a lot of his solo stuff. Even the Yardbirds have gone back that far, but I think as a person, I have to effectively give him a thumbs down at this point. But a lot of very talented musicians are like him, or even worse, so I try not to judge music that way. But if you hate Eric Clapton personally, I'm totally cool with that at this point, though I will still defend the music. Well, I hope you're doing okay. Thanksgiving's coming up, and the weather is still quite nice here in Richmond, so we are enjoying some balmy days in mid-November. I'll be talking with you soon. Take care. Bye.